Interesting. Let's go the blind person.
Yeah. So, the third of the 10 points of evidence that convince me is when people blind from birth have a near-death experience, they can see. And they report the same things that near-death experiencers that are sighted report seeing on the other side.
Kidding.
No kidding.
How many cases of this have you seen?
I put, I think, 3 in Imagine Heaven and 3 others I interviewed in Imagine the God of Heaven. So and this is wild. So Vicky, she died in a car accident. She was about 22, I think. And then they resuscitated her. Then the hospital, they're operating on her, and she codes again, and she's up above her body, and they say different things. Fascinating, because they're trying to adjust to this new sense, and they start to realize, oh, this must be sight. But it's a different kind of sight, because it's a different order of magnitude of sight as well. And so Vicky realizes from her wedding ring that it had an orange blossom on it, that she had felt that this, and her long hair, this must be her. Like, I must be dead. But she felt great. And it was chaos. And she was like, I'm out of here. Like, she knew Jesus. She knew where she was going. She's like, I'm out of here. I don't want to be here. I know where I'm going. And she takes off, and she said through this, she called it a tube or a tunnel. And what was colorful, all of a sudden there was, she called no color, black, but that's the way she described it. And she comes out in the end of this tube and is kind of like deposited in this garden-like setting, grass and flowers and trees and just immaculate beauty. But as they commonly say, but with colors we don't even have here on earth, and a vividness we don't even have here on earth. But the way Vicky and other blind people describe it is they say things like, it was different shades of brightness. So, how would you describe color?
Yeah.
If you don't really know it. But they would describe it like that. But what's fascinating is, so then she has this welcoming committee of people coming toward her. Her grandmother, Debbie and Darlene, who died. She grew up in a home for the blind, and they died at age 9 and 7 of other complications. And she said that I recognized them, but they were in their prime. And this is a fascinating thing, is people often say, sometimes they'll see like a grandparent as they remember them best, like they're older. But sometimes, and most of the time, people are about, they say, in their 30s. Late 20s, 30s. So she says they're in their prime. And but here's a fascinating thing. So Vicky and then Brad Burroughs, who was a 8-year-old kid, also blind from birth when he died, he also sees his roommate, hearing him choking, and his roommate stumbling out, later reported that. He too goes up above the home that they lived in, saw the snow and the plow, and he'd never seen his playground, and then he goes up and he's in this meadow, he says this giant meadow of like beautiful tall grass. He saw palm trees, and he said, but everything was soaking in this light. It was like this light just soaking in everything, and the light was palpable. You could feel the light, and the light conveyed love. Now, Vicky said almost the same thing. So she said this light was coming out of the birds, out of the trees, out of the flowers, and even out of the people, but the light was life and the light was love all together. Okay, so hang on to that thought for a second. Blind people would not hear that light comes out of everything. They would have heard on earth that light shines on things, right? So how do you have consistently blind people reporting that the light of heaven comes out of everything? And that's what sighted near-death experiencers say as well. Now, interestingly, back to the prophet Isaiah chapter 60, God tells the prophet Isaiah, there is no sun or moon in heaven because God is its light. Revelation chapter 21, John, one of Jesus' disciples, said he was taken up in a vision of heaven, saw heaven. And he said the city of God, which he describes, he said he was up on a very high mountain, and he then describes this city of God. And he said, but there was no sun or moon, for the glory of God is its light, and the Lamb, referring to Jesus, is his lamp, and the nations will walk in that light. This is Revelation 21.
Wow.
Now, how do you make this up to get people who are blind from birth claiming they did die, and then claiming they're talking about the light of heaven operating the way a prophet from 780 BC and one of Jesus' disciples in about 90 AD write the same thing? So that's just 3 of the points of evidence.
Yeah.
And there are many more.
Let's hit the Rwandan, if you don't mind,
Yeah.
and then we'll get into all 10 of them.
So what's fascinating in this new book, Shawn, is that I believe God brought me testimonies of people from every continent, every religious background, and yet they are consistently experiencing the same God. They're describing the same God. It doesn't matter where they are or what their expectation was. So, for instance, this one guy in Rwanda, fascinating story. His mother was a Hutu and his father was a Tutsi. So, if you know anything about the Rwandan genocide, those were the two that killed each other. And his father was a sheikh and an imam in the Muslim religion. Mom was a prophetess of the native goddess Bako. And it's a long story, fascinating story. In the Rwandan genocide, his family got torn apart. His father gets put in prison, blames his mom, divorces his mom. At age 8, he gets put out on the street, pretty much begging for food, ends up doing drugs and then dealing drugs to make money. And had been through, a lot of trauma, a lot of stuff. And then he ends up getting blood cancer. And he's dying of this blood cancer. They put him on palliative care. His father had tried to get the Muslims to, do their rituals and pray for him, and they put the Quran on his head and all this, and nothing worked. His mom went to, her goddess and tried all that. That didn't work. Her son's dying. She goes to the Anglican church because she had seen someone healed in the name of Jesus. And she was desperate. So she said, will you pray for my son in the name of Jesus? And she was too, and they were fasting and praying for a week. Meanwhile, her son dies. So Swadik is his name. He dies, and he finds himself in this hellish place. Hellish near-death experiences are not uncommon, by the way. Of people reporting near-death experiences, 23% report hellish experiences.
Wow.
So I do a whole chapter in Imagine Heaven, kind of trying to make sense of all that, because you can't take the good and leave the bad. You got to make sense of both, right? So he starts off having this hellish experience in this room that he called like a slaughterhouse. And these 3 creatures, is all I can call them, attacking him. And when he said, into the room comes this man of light in a robe with a gold sash and light just coming out of him, shooting into Swadik's eyes, he said, and just going through my whole soul. And he held out his arms like this, and Swadik saw the holes in his hands. And then he knew who it was, because Mel Gibson's The Passion of Christ had come to Rwanda, and he had seen it accidentally. And so Jesus says to him, I died for mankind. You're among those I died for. Never deny it and tell it to everyone. He wakes up, sits up with a cloth over his face, and all these people just start screaming. And he looks down to his right, and there's a grave. And he didn't know what's going on. So it had been overnight, and they were at his burial. And he sits up, and he starts saying, Jesus is here. Jesus saved me. Jesus is the one who brought me back. And all these Muslims are going, they're just freaking out. About half of them did come to faith in Jesus that day because they saw it. Today, he is an Anglican pastor who has had 7 attempts on his life, including his father trying to poison him. Because you can't convert in an Islamic country. Mm-hmm. And I talked to Swadik. I mean, he's a courageous young guy, and he's like, I asked him, are you afraid? And he's like, why would I be afraid? He brought me back from death, and he told me tell everybody, so he won't shut up.
Wow. Let's move into the 10 points of evidence. So after the 1,500 interviews you've conducted with people that have had NDEs, what are those 10 points?
Well, I've gone over 3 of them. The verifiable observations, blind people being able to see things they shouldn't have heard. Along with that are things that are commonly reported that are not common to Earth, like telepathic or thought-to-thought, heart-to-heart communication, experienced across the whole. Children, doctors, lawyers, CEOs, a lot of the people I interview, by the way, they are professionals who have a lot to lose, claiming they went to heaven and saw God, right? And yet they say, it's the most real thing that happened to me. So they're willing to risk what the harm it causes their career because it's why they think they're back here. So blind people experiencing people they didn't know had died on the other side. Like, for instance, one woman in her near-death experience sees this man who is smiling warmly at her with this kind of like loving look. She doesn't know who this is, but has a sense like I know him or I'm supposed to know him. Comes back 10 years later. On her deathbed, her mother tells her she was born out of an extramarital affair. Shows the picture of the man, and that was the man she saw in her near-death experience, her father.
Wow.
Or in other cases, someone who, in one case it was a child who meets someone on the other side who tells them to tell this other person who they knew something, and comes back and they didn't even know that other person had died, but sure enough, they had died and they were bringing a message back. So, that's the third. The fourth is that, I've chronicled about 40 commonly reported elements of a near-death experience. Things like out of your body, able to observe things, new powers of sight, for instance, telepathic communication, this place of exquisite beauty, colors beyond our color spectrum, beauty not unlike Earth, but at the same time experienced in new dimensions, time not working the same. What
do you mean by that, time not working the same?
Well, interestingly, another one of Jesus' disciples, Peter, in 2 Peter 3:8 writes, "To the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day." Well, NDEers say the same thing. They've said it this way to me. They've said there was no time on the other side. Or others say, no, there was time, but there was all the time you needed. Time didn't work the same way there. And it wasn't always like linear like we experience it here. They're like all happened together, which we can't even conceptualize. But I talk in Imagine Heaven about how two-dimensional time would give that appearance. It would have that feel to it. So all these commonalities.
Does that mean when you say there's no concept of time, does that mean you're experiencing everything all at once?
Well, here's the way I describe it. Like in this life, we experience time as a line going in one direction, one-dimensional, right? So one point to the next, you can never go back, right? Or that's the way we experience it. That's one-dimensional time. A second dimension would mean at every point on that timeline, there's another line going vertical. So imagine if at every point on our linear timeline, you could experience time on a vertical line that was infinitely up, say. That would have the feel that at each moment of time, even though time is moving or it can move, you also have all the time in the world at every point in time. I mean, we can't experience it. We can only imagine it, right? Which is part of what I'm trying to get people to do is imagine. so much better than anything we've thought of. Like people, I find people fear heaven or the life to come because anything in this life becomes boring. I don't care how great it is, right? Eventually it's like, I got to do something else. So we can't imagine anything forever. But that's assuming we're talking about one-dimensional time and just the same thing going on forever. And it's not like that at all. I like to say it's more like if you've ever been in the zone. You know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Like if you're creating something or you're so absorbed in something you're doing that like time's your enemy because you don't want it to move on. It's like you've lost time. I think it's more like that.
It's a great, I've not heard that before. Thank you.
Yeah, so you want me to keep going with the evidences?
The 40 points is what we're on.
Well, so there are 40 different commonalities that people report like that I've chronicled in the books. And like I said, I'm showing how they align with what God's been revealing all along. It's not new. But if this was just in the brain, so some of the alternate hypotheses that people will say, and there are different ones that come out every year. Shawn, there have been like 30 alternate explanations for near-death experiences. I've heard them all. Oh, that's exactly like in DMT. That's no different. Well, yeah, it is, because you can't have vertical perception that can be checked out and observed. Blind people taking DMT can't see. It's like there's a lot of different stuff, right?
Plus, you're dead.
Plus, you're dead. Dead.
You're dead.
I like to point that out to people.
Dead.
Like, some people will say to me, well, I wish I could have an experience like that. I'm like, no, you don't. You don't know what these people went through coming back. They almost all have a scar right there from their tracheotomy.
Well, here's the good news. You will have an experience like that eventually.
Well, that's the good part.
You just won't come back.
The comeback is the bad part.
Okay.
They're often depressed coming back. They don't want to come back. It's hard coming back. One guy told me it's like being put back into the sewer when you've experienced paradise, So anyway, another alternate explanation that skeptics will say is that this is just in the brain. Like when you're dying, endorphins are flooding the brain. There are a lot of chemicals flooding the brain. It's the brain's way of coping. It just gives us a pleasurable way of shutting the computer down. Well, most have gone away from that now because they realize that doesn't explain most of these other phenomena. So they've now said, well, as the brain is rebooting, then it's coming up with this experience. And the reason they say that is because, think about it, our memories are stored in neural networks in our brain. That's electrical activity. So when you have a flat EEG for hours, where are these memories being stored? Well, that doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
Which is another point of evidence. So then they say, well, maybe it's when the brain's being rebooted that all this is happening. But again, it doesn't explain verifiable observations. It doesn't explain the blind. It doesn't explain meeting people you didn't know were dead on the other side. And if it's just in the brain, why aren't these commonalities 100%? If it's just a human brain thing, why is it that 57% of NDEers experience relatives who have died before them? Why isn't it 100%?
57%.
57%. 31% get a life review. All right? So they have this panoramic reliving of their lives. But if it's just a brain thing, why wouldn't 100% or 0% get a life review? 48% experience the same God of light and love who, like I said, is the same all around the globe. But why wouldn't it be 100%? And why wouldn't it be what their cultural expectation was? So the very fact that there are commonalities, but not commonalities that are all 100% the same, each is a bit unique. If you have, let's say you have a court of law, and we try to prove things beyond a reasonable doubt based on testimony, based on evidence, right? Mm-hmm. If you have 10 people who say exactly the same thing about an accident or a crime, that usually is sketchy. That's collusion, because that means they talked. If they say exactly the same thing. But if they say overlappingly the same thing with different details that aren't the same but unique, well, that's the strongest testimony. And that's what you have with near-death experiences.